What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of RBT Resistance Band Training. And in this video, we're gonna pick up where we left off last week, where I promised I would give you the perfect formula for building muscle or triggering muscle hypertrophy. So real quick, just to recap what we talked about in the last video. But if you haven't seen it, make sure you go back and check that out, because everything that we're gonna talk about here is gonna make a whole lot more sense, because building muscle is more than just lifting heavier and heavier and heavier all the time. So that's why I did the video, is I think there's a lot of misunderstandings out there of what it is that actually causes our bodies to respond and build muscle. So the first one, if you remember, was mechanical tension. In other words, the amount of resistance that we're using. Now, it doesn't matter if you're using free weights or machines or resistance bands. Your body only knows tension. It doesn't know the difference between them as long as you're getting the proper amount of tension. Now, there's more to just how much weight we're using. It's also how long our muscle is under tension. That's what we call time under tension. So the first thing is making sure that we get the proper amount. Now, we know based on last week's video that we need to be at about 75% of our 1 rep max in order to trigger muscle growth. If we go too light, now we're talking about muscular endurance. If we go too heavy, now we're talking about strength building. So 75% of our 1 rep max is ideal. But doing 1 or 2 reps, that's not gonna trigger muscle development, and that's where time under tension comes in. So go back, watch that. You'll know that we need 30 to 70 seconds of time under tension per set to build muscle. So that is number 1, mechanical tension. Number 2, metabolic stress. Now this is where bodybuilders, they actually know this stuff. It's instinctual to them. They know that the pump is very important for triggering muscle growth, and it's true. So what is metabolic stress, or what is the pump? Well, when our muscle starts to fatigue and we go into anaerobic metabolism, so going from an aerobic state to an anaerobic state, our muscle starts to build up lactate and other metabolites in there. A lot of blood comes into the muscle, and this is what we call the pump. It's also what we call the burn. Some people say it's lactic acid. It's not lactic acid, it's lactic acidosis. So we have a buildup of lactate and acidity in the muscle. And so that's that burn that you feel. And both that pump and the burn are a good thing, because they too are triggers for protein synthesis, therefore muscle building. So that is number 2. And the third one was muscle damage. In other words, we know that if we're sore the next day, which, by the way, that soreness is not lactic acid like some people think. That soreness the next day is actually muscle damage. It's micro tears to the muscle. Now, a little bit of damage is a good thing, and that stimulates protein synthesis. Too much is a bad thing, because all of our protein synthesis is then going towards rebuilding, not building new muscle. So we want to cause just enough muscle damage to go ahead and stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So the perfect formula. We talked about bringing it all together. So what does that formula look like? So on the board, we've got a highlight here, our summary mechanical tension. We know that we need at least 75% of our 1 rep max in order to get the proper amount of tension or resistance. And we know that we need at least 30 to 70 seconds of time under tension. Now, for mechanical tension, to isolate this one separate, although mechanical tension plays a part in these others as well, when I'm thinking about mechanical tension or how to maximize this for muscle growth, I'm thinking about how do I maximize literally the amount of tension that I'm getting. So I'm focusing on getting as much resistance as I can. So I'm even gonna creep up maybe towards the 80% of my 1 rep max, to making sure that I'm lifting as heavy as I can and still staying within my 30 to 70 seconds of time under tension. So what does that look like? Well, that's going to be a nice controlled rep speed. So if I were to add something to this list, it would be focusing on controlled rep speed. So a 1 second concentric, a nice squeeze at the top, but a nice controlled eccentric. So we're gonna be looking at least 3 seconds of time under tension per rep, multiplied by 10 reps. In other words, I don't want to go higher rep count, because I'm trying to focus on heavier weights and still stay within our proper time under tension, but now we're at the bottom end of that. So moving to metabolic stress, how do we maximize metabolic stress in our workout? Well, now we're gonna switch some of our sets and we're gonna focus on more volume. Have you ever noticed when you do 5 or 6 reps that you don't get that same kind of pump that you do when you're doing higher volume? In other words, like 12, 13, 14, 15 reps. So instead of focusing on 10 reps, we're gonna go as high as 12 to 20 reps, still controlling our rep speed as well, and focusing on peak contractions. We know that peak contractions, when our muscle is in that shortened state, that it drives a lot of blood into the muscle. And that's what we're talking about, driving a lot of blood in there and getting a big pump. To do that, we need peak contractions. You hear me say it all the time. To do that, we need isometrics. You gotta focus on that squeeze. It's the most neglected of the 3 contractions between the concentric and the eccentric. The isometric is the one that I see people skipping right past. And if you wanna maximize metabolic stress, or forget metabolic stress, if you wanna maximize the pump that you get in the gym, focus on those peak contractions or those isometrics. Now moving to muscle damage. So how do we maximize muscle damage? Well, you know that eccentrics are great for that, but our workouts in general are going to create micro trauma to the muscle as long as we have enough mechanical tension. So we have to use enough resistance. I like to try to go ahead and maximize it. Why is that? Well, because we know that in an eccentric contraction, we're at least 20, sometimes 30% stronger in an eccentric than we are a concentric. That's why when someone spots us, we may not be able to squeeze the dumbbell or the barbell up to the top, but if someone helps us, we can control it on the way down. That's because we're 20 to 30% stronger in an eccentric. So we need to make sure that we get maximum tension here. We can't go on the low side, make sure we go on the high side here. We also want to focus on getting more time under tension, not from volume or reps like we did with metabolic stress, but here we're doing it with time under tension on our negatives. We want to go with a 3 to 4 second negative. So maybe it's a 1 second on the concentric, but then controlling it all the way down. So we're talking about 40 to 50 seconds of time under tension with maximum tension on there. And those eccentrics, like I said, cause a lot of micro trauma to the muscle. So what we're talking about are 3 different strategies that we can incorporate into one workout. So one is using the heaviest weight that we can control with good form for our 10 reps. We're talking about higher volume or higher rep counts, but focusing on isometric contractions or good squeezes at the top. And here we're talking about, again, maximizing the amount of resistance that we're moving, but now we're focusing on the eccentric, so controlling those. So all 3 of these, you see that you can integrate, even though they're slightly different, you can incorporate all 3 of these things into every single routine. So that's why you want to vary your rep speed and also your rep count within each of your exercises. So that's why you see people break up their rep and set structure. There's a strategy here. There's a reason you want to do that. All right, with that being said, let's bring this to life here. Let me show you exactly how I break this down in my own training routine using resistance bands and some of the techniques that I use, especially with eccentrics here and adjusting my resistance level with the bands, which is one of the things that I like about band training, which is that linear variable resistance. So I'm gonna show you a couple little tricks here. Trained a long time without ever using gloves, but if you train with resistance bands, I definitely recommend wearing gloves. The friction of the bands will tear your hands up if you don't. People ask me what the downside of band training is, and that's one of them. So make sure you get some good gloves. These are especially made for resistance band training, so they have padding on the sides of the palm, the inside of the thumb, where you actually feel a lot of pressure with resistance bands. You don't feel it on the palm like you do with free weights. So I'm gonna show you some tricks here with some biceps exercises, how we incorporate mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage specific to resistance band training. Now the first one, we've talked about linear variable resistance in the past, but think of it this way. Depending on where I grab this band, in other words, how much slack I take out of the band, the harder it is, because the more you stretch resistance bands, the harder they are. So if I were to grab this at the top, this is going to be a lot easier than if I grab it much lower and stretch it. Now I've got more tension. So here's one of the cool things. If you've ever done drop sets using dumbbells, where you pick up a heavy set of dumbbells, do as many reps as you can, then you set it down and you grab a lighter set and you keep going down. Well, I can do that easily here with resistance bands just by adjusting my grip. So if I grip down low and start off, and after doing a couple reps it gets too hard, all I have to do, just let a little bit of band slip through my hand, not trying to rhyme, and now it gets easier. With that being said, it also allows me to adjust my resistance level. We know based on what we said on the board, we want the maximum amount of resistance for the ideal amount of time under tension. So with resistance bands, I'm able to make those little subtle adjustments there, get as much resistance as possible, but still get the proper amount of time under tension. So I know that I can hit my exact target. People always say, well, how is it that you time that so perfect that right at 10 you just happen to be hitting the wall? But that's because I'm making those little adjustments as I go. When I'm using dumbbells, a lot of times, maybe I pick up some that are too heavy and then I fall short. If I'm going for 10, I can only hit 8. Or maybe I pick up some that are too light, and then by the time I get to 10, it's too easy and I feel like I could keep going. But with the bands, I can make those little adjustments on the fly. And that's one of the things I really love about it for getting maximum amount of resistance and hitting my target for time under tension. So when it comes to mechanical tension, know that resistance bands can create the same kind of tension that weights can or machines can. Like I've always said, tension is tension, but again, I can make those micro adjustments. And this is actually gonna play into eccentrics as well, but I don't wanna skip past metabolic stress. So metabolic stress, if you go back and watch the previous video, we talked about the fact that in a peak contraction, we're driving a lot of blood into the muscle. Well, think about with biceps, if I were doing curls right now with a dumbbell, right here I'm kind of in this locked position. This is my peak contraction. This is where I want the most amount of resistance. I don't want to be resting right here like you do with dumbbells. But with resistance bands, I'm getting maximum resistance, meaning that with that linear variable resistance, the more that I stretch it, the more tension I have. So at the peak here, at the very top, that's when I'm getting the most amount of resistance. And that's one of the reasons why with resistance bands you get such a great pump, because you get that good peak contraction. Now remember what we said on the board here, we want to focus on those isometrics, those squeezes. And so with resistance band training, you can get that tension, that peak tension at the top of the range of motion. And that's one of the advantages of linear variable resistance. But now moving into eccentric training, and this is one of the things where people say, well, if you have linear variable resistance, meaning that the more I stretch this band, the harder it gets, meaning it's easier at the bottom, well, doesn't that also mean that you have, let's call it a descending tension? So in other words, as I do my eccentric or my negative, that it gets easier and easier and easier. Now here's the thing. You can have both linear variable resistance with bands, or you can take some of that linear variable resistance out. How do you do that? By pre-stretching it. So we know that the more we stretch a band, the harder it gets. So by pre-stretching it, we're actually taking all that slack out. In other words, it's no longer easy at the bottom and hard at the top. It's hard all the way through the range of motion. So it's more of a constant tension like you would get with free weights. So when we're doing eccentric training with bands, that's what I like to focus on. So we want to make it harder by pre-stretching the band. Now here's one of the cool tricks though. If you're doing negatives with free weights, you need a spotter. You need someone to help you on the concentric. So let's say that I take all the slack out here and I make this really hard, and it's too hard for me to go ahead and squeeze up on the concentric, just like it would be with a dumbbell. What I can do is I can squat down and I can get the band in position and I can stand up. Now it's pre-stretch here, and now I just focus on controlling the negatives. And I can do that for each rep. Whew. Now, resistance bands actually want to return back to their original length pretty rapidly. I mean, think about shooting a rubber band or a slingshot, how fast it is. Well, resistance bands are kind of like a big slingshot, so they actually want to pull back to their original position rapidly. So it requires you to resist that and control that, which is part of what eccentrics are. So in a way, they actually want to pull back to the starting position much faster than free weights would fall naturally with gravity. So contrary to popular belief, you can do very effective eccentric training with resistance bands. Now remember, I'm not just advocating resistance bands, happens to be the way that I like to train, but if you train with free weights or machines, whatever you want to train with, still, you want to focus on these strategies, getting the right amount of mechanical tension, right amount of time under tension, making sure that you're getting those peak contractions, those good isometric squeezes, varying your rep count and your rep speed, also focusing on those eccentrics as well, incorporating all those things together. And again, no matter how you train, that's going to help you go ahead and maximize muscle development. So hopefully you found it helpful. If so, give it a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because we're going to be coming out with a lot of content like this and you don't want to miss any. I'm James Grage and this is RBT, and I'll see you guys next video.